Meeting formally opened at 2 o'clock. A few items of the housekeeping rules. We're not expecting fire alarm testing today, so should the alarm sound, please vacate as quickly as possible using the procedures of the Council House Fire and Emergency Policy. Please speak into the microphone when addressing the meeting and switch the microphone off when you are finished speaking. Also need to tell you that because we are in the Warspite room, this will be on video. The meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeat viewing. By entering the Warspite room and during the course of the meeting, councillors are consenting to being filmed and the use of those recordings for webcasting. So welcome all to the November Audit and Governance Committee meeting. Move on to item number 1 of the agenda, apologies. I have apologies from Councillor Evans, and Councillor Penberthy is the substitute. Welcome, Councillor, to today's meeting. Moving on, item number 2 of the agenda, declarations of interest. Do any members have aught to declare?
Member of the DAP, Devon Audit Commission.
And I would also declare that as well, and possibly the PIP, the pension, the investment partnership, which I've recently been made a director of. So moving on to item number 3 of the agenda.
Just for clarity, Chair, are you referring to Plymouth Investment Partnership?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, noted. Thank you. Moving on to item number 3 of the agenda. The minutes of previous meetings, of course, we were all rather spoilt in September. We had 2 meetings. We had the EGM and we had the full Audit and Governance meeting on the 29th. The minutes have been circulated. They are in your pack. Those members present at the meetings, do you deem them to be a true reflection of what transpired? Yes. Any matters arising, Vice Chair, on the minutes?
Nope. Good.
Excellent. I will sign those at the end of the meeting in the usual fashion. Thank you. Item number 4 of the agenda, Chair's urgent business. I was going to say there is no urgent business, but the Vice Chair has very kindly focused me in on a question that was raised at full council about investments with the Qatar Bank. This council do not invest in those type of policies. We have a strategic management structure, treasury management set of rules in place which prohibit that sort of investment. So the short answer is, and I will confirm to the member in writing, that we do not invest in Qatar Bank. Thank you. So we then move on to item number 5 of the agenda, which is quite a lengthy document. It's the external audit and the auditor's report 2021-2022, which you will find in your papers on the pages 13 to 52. And we are pleased to have Mr. Dossett present here. I believe you would like to present that report, Mr. Dossett. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Members will recall from the September meeting that I presented the 1920 audit findings report, which concluded on value for money arrangements, but the accounts work has not been completed. There's essentially two outstanding items. One is a national issue about infrastructure assets and the accounting for infrastructure assets, which we're pleased to note that is on the verge of being resolved and should result in a statutory override to address the issues arising from that. So that issue is a national issue and will be resolved this side of Christmas, or certainly this side of 2022, which will enable those audits where that's an outstanding matter, and there's a large number of audits where that's an outstanding matter, to be resolved in January. The second issue was around the pension transaction, which obviously was set out in our report in September, and that's obviously an ongoing issue. So what this report is, this report reflects our value for money work for 2 years, which are the 2021 year and the 21-22. Now, the reason we've combined the two is the passage of time, and clearly we don't want to bring this sort of commentary. I mean, some aspects of this they naturally fall out of date as things move on. But clearly, what we wanted to do was to make sure we're as up to date as possible in our value for money commentary. And so you have a report which effectively covers two financial years. It is by its nature an interim report because there's the accounts audits. This report can only be finalised once the accounts are finalised, and obviously those 2 years still remain unaudited. So it's an interim report and it covers those 2 years. The National Audit Office changed the approach to value for money for the year beginning 1st of April 2020. And so the National Audit Office had this new approach that they brought in, which is hence the very detailed report you see in front of you. And the National Audit Office basically requires auditors to give a commentary on 3 areas: financial sustainability, governance, and economy efficiency and effectiveness. And this report is the vehicle for us doing so. And not surprisingly, perhaps, in the current environment, which we're all aware of in local government and local government finance, with the challenges of demand-led pressures, the challenges of inflation, this is the biggest issue facing all local authorities. And members may have seen, for example, the Croydon Section 114 report issued last week, and that's obviously accounts with particular challenges. But you may also have seen the risks set out by Hampshire County Council and Kent County Council about their financial position going forward. And these are 2 councils who sort of traditionally would be in a very strong financial position, being large counties and having large reserves. But clearly, members there have felt the need to make public their concerns about the financial position. And there's a range of other authorities out there in a similar sort of vein. So it's no great surprise that this report focuses on financial sustainability and the risks facing the council around this. Now, by nature of the report, as I said, some of these things are fast-moving issues, so some of the points we've made either have been addressed or in the process of being addressed. But if you turn to page page 15 of the pack, you'll see a sort of summary table which sets out the conclusions in all 3 areas. And essentially what we've said is in financial sustainability there are 3 key recommendations, and a key recommendation under the Code of Practice is one we think is very important and has to be addressed. And the improvement recommendations are essentially good practice type recommendations. So you'll see from the table on page 15 that there are no key recommendations for governance and improving economy efficiency and effectiveness. And we are talking about arrangements in place at the council rather than absolute judgments on, for example, value for money. So you see no key recommendations there, but in the financial sustainability area, there are 3 key recommendations, and those recommendations are set out on page 16, and they effectively reflect 3 things, and these are the 3 sort of key points I'd like to make to members. Firstly, about council tax levels. Now, obviously, ultimately, that's a decision for members to make on the advice of officers. But clearly, from an audit point of view, if we are reviewing arrangements for financial sustainability, use of all the mechanisms the council has in place to increase its income and increase its base income are things we as auditors would tend to expect people to address. The medium-term financial plan, really difficult given it's a moving feast, and we have inflation at levels that none of us saw coming a year ago. So that's a really difficult thing, but we think that the medium-term financial plan, as well as the ongoing budget work for 23-24, are of highest possible importance. And there was a further very Plymouth-specific point about arrangements in finance, because if we take a broader look at challenges facing local authorities, it's really important that the finance function is strong and well supported, because whilst it's quite easy in times of stress financially to look at the back office, so to speak, and maybe look at that for savings, but we tend to sort of feel that strong finance team with the right resource base is even more important in this environment than it might be normally. So again, we're just essentially making clear recommendations that the council needs to maintain a strong finance support to members in terms of managing the finances and key decisions. So that's the framing of this report. As I said, it's effectively an interim report because it can't be ever finalised until the accounts are signed off. Management have provided some initial commentary on that, but I wouldn't necessarily expect fully fledged recommendations until we move to sort of a closure of the accounting work in the next few months and into 2023. But obviously, it's really important from our point of view these recommendations are addressed on financial sustainability. I'll probably leave it there, Chair, and happy to take any questions that members have. In the meantime, my colleague Justine Thorpe has joined remotely, and so she's also able to answer any questions that members have as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dossett, for that comprehensive report. I have two questions arising from the report. The first one, straightforward. You mentioned the sign-off of the 2019-2020 accounts, and there's some legislation afoot which will bring some closure to this issue. For members present who may wish to track that through, that's presumably through Parliament, it's a bill that's going through Parliament now. Could you give me the reference, or do you happen to know the...
So I don't happen to know the precise reference, but it's a statutory override that's been laid by Department for Levelling Up and Communities and Housing. So I think they're laying it this week, towards the end of the week, maybe next week. My understanding is that this is not a matter for people to sort of vote for and against it. I think it's a formality in reality. But it has to go through that parliamentary process. It comes, as far as we understand, it comes into force in and around Christmas Day, and therefore we are expecting auditors to be able, if this is the only issue outstanding for a particular authority, we expect auditors would then be able to sign those accounts that are outstanding off from sort of January the 2nd effectively. So what we will see nationally is a major increase in audits being signed off. It prevents Plymouth being signed off even if all other matters have been resolved. So this is for Plymouth, from Plymouth point of view, this is one issue that falls away, and then we just have to effectively largely sort of resolve the pension transaction, which is ongoing. So that's where we are in totality.
Thank you. And the second question is in overview. I mean, clearly you deal with a lot of local authorities and have a barometer for this. How do we stand in comparison with others? I mean, you mentioned some 144 motions going ahead, so there's going to be a number who are in the dire straits, and equally there's going to be a number with massive reserves. Where do we fare in between, please?
So I guess a contextual piece is that Plymouth is a relatively small unitary authority, and all unitary authorities have virtually all have some financial challenges because of economies of scale and other factors. You obviously have some particular issues around high demand pressures, some recruitment and retention issues related to location. So there's lots of specific pressures that you have. In terms of the financial position, clearly, I think members have focused perhaps on, I'm taking a sort of longer term view, looking backwards, obviously on delivering high quality services and supporting communities. And the financial position has drifted a bit. That having been said, I think the steps you're taking towards your 23-24 budget, the sort of consultation that you're doing, and the sort of flagging of the savings you need to make, and I think our report quotes the chief executive talking to members about the financial position in July and making it very clear that the position was urgent. So I think what we're seeing is a trajectory of moving in the right direction, some clarity over the choices that members have going forward, which I think is very helpful. So whilst I would put you in the towards the higher risk end, not at the section 114 tomorrow end, but at the higher risk end, my observation is that you're making progress to address those issues, but it will involve, as I'm sure members are already aware, some very hard political choices, because this is an environment where the Chancellor's made it very clear that there's not really going to be much extra funding for local government, and then you've got inflation running at 10%, and that funding may be a few percent. So it's a very difficult position when you're starting with a relatively low general fund reserve position. So towards the lower end of the spectrum, but not in the sort of red flashing lights zone yet.
Thank you very much indeed. Before we move to sort of questions and comments, does your colleague wish to add anything further at this stage?
Not at this stage, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, members will note that on pages 16 and 17 of the report, the 14 recommendations are laid before you. Is there any specific points you wish to make on those points? Vice Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. The report section is referred to as value for money. I kind of implore you to explain exactly what you mean by that, because the reason I'm somewhat struggling here is because you've made a number of recommendations at a very, very, very high level, basically. And I'm just curious as to know how much detail you go into from a value for money perspective against each service to come to that conclusion, because you've effectively said that you're of the expectation that it would be appropriate for the council to put its council tax up by approximately 5% this year. And yet, in the context of the value for money argument, are we doing well in children's services, or are we doing bad compared to other local authorities? So there's no context as to the reason why you want that, other than we're all struggling a bit for some very obvious reasons. So perhaps you could give me some more information, please.
Thank you, Councillor. So in terms of what we're required to do in terms of value for money, we are required to not sort of judge value for money on a sort of benchmarked comparison of services with other authorities, but to put in place, to carry out an assessment of the arrangements you have in place to achieve value for money. So if we take something like children's services or adult services, how do we judge that as auditors? Well, one of the main criteria we use to judge that is what is your regulator of those services saying. So, for example, if CQC or Ofsted or other regulators come in and say that council's arrangements are inadequate, for example, for child safety or whatever, that's the sort of thing we play into our assessment, because what we're looking at there is not absolute numbers, because each authority is different, and it's very easy to say the unit cost is cheaper at this place or whatever. That doesn't necessarily give us an assessment of arrangement. So what we do, we don't evaluate every service, but we do look at the arrangements that are in place. So because the council is not in a bad place with those regulators and hasn't got the sort of action outstanding that some other authorities have, we conclude that those arrangements are adequate. What we're saying about finance and why finance is the area we're focusing on, because the council has a duty to achieve a balanced budget position by law, which is essentially setting a budget for the following year, which has the capacity to be managed with or without the use of reserves. That is what our concern is, and that's why we make those recommendations. So the council has no choice but to do that under law, and therefore, from our point of view, we feel able to make these type of comments, because putting the council tax up, for example, is a choice. It can also an alternative to make further savings. It does eradicate the base if you don't put council tax up, but nevertheless, you could choose to make savings instead, or find other ways of raising money. So they are choices. So what we're saying here is, all other things being equal, the council's arrangements in particular services being, at least adequate, one of the main ways of dealing with the financial position that has to be dealt with is to use the council tax increase up to the referendum limit. So that's what we're advising. We're not advising. We're saying that's an option, clear option that members have, and what we expect most councils to do. And of course, perhaps crucially, putting council tax up by the referendum limit is built into all government assessments of local authority funding, and hence that's an assumption the government is making as well.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Councillor Finn.
I do take some comfort in the report you brought before us this afternoon, because when we talk about section 114 as relevant to other local authorities, let's say Croydon, savage for collective corporate blindness or lax financial controls despite a series of formal audit warnings, and a corporate culture of failing to challenge or scrutinise financial decisions made by the leadership. So I do take comfort in that we're not in that position, and we're not too financially challenged. However, under key recommendations, you use the word may both reduce its funding gap and build up a sustainable level of reserves. What wriggle room is there with regard to that? Because obviously one has to take into consideration the pressures that families are under, and obviously their ability to pay. Reference to recommendation 2, I do follow that real-time data with regard to financial management is a key and something that does need to be looked at. So I suppose my question is regard to 1, when you say may, can you just clarify that, please?
So I think what I'm saying here is that by putting that, by increasing the council tax, it gives that opportunity to increase the funding base going forward. I take the point about, obviously this is difficult because on the one hand you have pressures on families, you do have options or a council tax support scheme as well, but that's still potentially challenging as well. And I think this is all about sort of political choices and options. But every time the council chooses not to put council tax up, then it has to do something different. Either use reserves, which is, in our view, not going to be appropriate, because you have to have sustainable reserves to deal with challenges of the future, or to make other savings. Now, again, that's a political choice. It's not for me to say what you should or shouldn't do in that context. I think what we're saying is, if government are making the assumption about the council tax base, and it is an option, it may be a more straightforward way of dealing with the council's financial challenges than some of the other options. And it's a sustainable way, in the way that, for example, some savings can be one-off in nature. So that's why we're making that recommendation.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? Do you want a supplementary? No. Mrs. Benny.
Hi there, thank you. So I'm interested in terms of those recommendations have been made. Have they been made relatively recently? Is that sort of, I'm just interested in the timeline to start with.
Yes. So the report work was carried out by my colleague Justine over the summer and into October. So that's the time frame of it. I mean, some of the detailed commentary in the report naturally reflects historical periods as well, but that's the sort of time frame of it. And of course, I think, as I said in my sort of opening words, obviously this is quite a fast moving thing, and the council are obviously at the moment in the process of taking a number of actions to particularly address the challenges of both the 23-24 budget, the extant 22-23 position, and obviously looking at the medium-term financial plan going forward.
Thank you. Can I just ask? Yeah. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So I just need to frame this for me, if that's all right. So the council, we're under a legal duty to break even. Yeah. So what we need to ensure and seek assurance, I suppose, as an audit committee, is that we've got some recommendations here. We need to understand the reaction of officers to those recommendations, and we also need to understand, I would want to understand, there's a recommendation, or if recommended, they allow for the increase in council tax. If that's not the case, what might the alternatives be? Because we ultimately have a legal duty to break even, and as an audit committee, we should be ensuring and assuring that we've got the right financial plans in place to fulfil that legal duty. Yeah? Is that right? So I suppose I'd like to hear from officers around the response to those recommendations, and then understand actually when are we planning to see the update around the medium-term financial plans to understand what options there are to deliver a break-even position. And I know that's a tall order.
Thank you, Mrs. Benny. Yes, of course, we are coming up to the budgetary time of year anyway, so I think there's an appropriate time to ask our 151 officer sitting next to me to comment, if you would.
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Benny. I knew you were going to be trouble. So, in terms of the dialogue with the external auditors and with Paul and the team, that never stops. It's a rolling programme, so we're always talking to him about what we can and cannot do and what our plans are and so on. So if that gives you some comfort about this hasn't suddenly come out of nowhere. So if I take something like updating the medium-term financial plan, one of my strong beliefs is yes, we should have a 5-year plan in place, and we always tried to work towards that, and then different events have overtaken, the main one being that successive chancellors only seem to work in 1-year windows. So it's encouraging, but not too encouraging, that in the autumn statement recently, we were actually given some kind of assurance that you can be 90, I think he said 95% confident that what the funding might look like for 24-25. So I think that's the first time in about 4 or 5 years that they've actually given us a bit of a clue of what might be coming, even though that's caveated by, and I've been part of discussions for the best part of 6 years about the whole revamp of our finances. So we were going to have a fair funding review on our grant funding. We've been waiting and waiting for somebody to step forward on business rates and say that's not the way it should be done, there's a fairer way to do it. What we've got now is a sort of a halfway house where there's some revaluations coming in, but all that's done is give me a bigger question mark, because what I thought might just be an answer to a question is now 2 questions and no answer, so that's that one. And then we get back to the council tax, don't we, and whether that is the right instrument and the right tool to try and solve our problems. Personally, obviously it's not, and introducing something like an adult social care precept to try and tackle the problems that we've got in our health and social care is clearly not working, because, and I say this to whoever wants to listen, in Plymouth we've got deprivation, we've got the low council tax bands, so even 5% doesn't, give us the riches that we need to close the door. So in terms of next year, you're absolutely right. We've been very public and open this year about the fact that we had a massive £37.6 million gap to fill. I think we've also been open and transparent and as timely as we can be about £26 million worth of savings that we put on the table. and that's out for public consultation. We've been very open with both opposition parties and scrutiny panels to say this is what we're doing, and we're not closed, we're open for businesses to what might come forward, but that still leaves us with, you know, the best part or the wrong side of 11 million to clear, and we've got to get a solution in place by the end of February. So your question is very pertinent, and it's a very clear question that I should be putting to the politicians, which is, well, if you don't have an appetite to go to the full 4.99%, what is the other option? Because even going to that full amount will not close that gap entirely. So there's still some work that I'm doing with officers and members to keep squeezing that gap anyway. So it is a tool in the box, and it's a very strong recommendation that we need to consider as we go forward.
Thank you. Councillor Penberthy.
Thank you, Chair. Wearing the hat of something on this committee rather than other hats, but sitting here with other hats on as well. Just picking up on that point about audit and assurance and the role that has in budget setting, what papers should go from audit and governance to budget scrutiny? I've just checked last year and there was no background paper from audit and governance at budget scrutiny. Now, that might have been me not requesting it when I was chairing the process, or it might have been us not actually thinking it was needed, or never having been offered it, so never having put it in before. But I just would be interested to know what papers might need to come from audit and governance into budget scrutiny, just so that we can make sure bosses they make a note of that, I know, but I think we need to know what it was that we were asking for. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Perry?
Thanks, and a good question, Councillor Penberthy. Clearly the timing of this report each year is not the same, and I think Mr. Dossett set out there have been some unusual circumstances this year connected with the some national issues as well as some local ones. So we wouldn't always get this report at this time just before the budget consultation or budget scrutiny position had happened. Even though this report is A, described as an interim report, and B, is supplied to the Audit and Governance Committee, this is kind of the way in for our external. This report is presented to the whole council as an interim report. Audit and Governance Committee is the recipient of it, but on behalf of the whole council. So in this, and given the sort of both weight and content of the recommendations, we would expect this to be an accompanying document to the whatever other papers are submitted for budget scrutiny, because clearly there's some there are recommendations about how this gets managed throughout the year and things to bear in mind while we're setting the budget and some of those other things. So I mean, whether any other work will be done between now and scrutiny to enable audit and governance to submit any other papers to budget scrutiny, I'm not sure, but I think it's a point well made that this document sits alongside the rest of the papers that are presented to budget scrutiny in terms of proposal, because I think it gives some really important context.
Any further questions?
Thanks, and I appreciate it's always a bit of a moving feast. I just wondered whether there might be an auditor perspective as opposed to an officer perspective as what went from an audit and governance committee to budget scrutiny, because presumably that is of interest to you as well.
I think the suggestions for officers are a good one in this particular good point in terms of the availability of this report. It's always useful to have external scrutiny or external commentary to inform the budget scrutiny process. So this more than happy for this report to go to that meeting. Clearly, there may be other external reviews that may be relevant to that. I would recommend to members the two reports actually. One, the recent Section 114 report from the financial director at Croydon is worth reading just because of the context. It's an extreme context, but there's some interesting background information in there. And the other one probably worth reading is a report that we produced in September, I think it was September, October, on public interest reports and the lessons learned from public interest reports. That was a document that was, it's quite a short report, it's about a 14-page report, but it draws all the lessons from public interest reports in the last 12 months. And that's just useful context as well, I think, because it shows where people have got into places, into spirals that they couldn't come out of. So those two would be two good examples for me.
Could I ask that links are sent to democratic support for early circulation to the budget scrutiny panel, rather than those specific extra reports being part of the pack, because it might be we need to do some education in advance of budget scrutiny. So I'm chairing budget scrutiny this year.
So certainly my colleague next door here has got the Croydon report to hand, so that can be dealt with. Any further questions or observations? Councillor Finn.
Yeah, just one. When we consider the report, obviously inflation is a constantly moving target. We don't know whether it's going either up or down. So what leverage, and I say that in the context of, is considered with regard to these figures for the projected budgets for 2022 to say 2025, is taken into account? Is it a plus minus figure, or are you just going to take that on a rolling year analysed basis?
So obviously, one of the challenges, as the Section 151 officer set out, is that government funding hasn't been clear over a long period of time, and then we've suddenly in this financial year got into this inflationary spiral where we don't know when that's going to end. So the council needs to make a judgment on what's inflation likely to be in 23, 24 and beyond. I mean, obviously there's lots of advice on that from the Bank of England and others about what their expectations are. So you'd imagine that some sort of assessment of those indications will be played into the budget process. I mean, it's difficult to say what that might be at this stage, but assumptions have to be made that government funding in reality is going to be at the levels currently predicted, which is the low, 2 to 3% type funding, and inflation is going to remain high for the short to medium term, and then therefore the council's challenges and all councils' challenges are difficult in that environment. So they have got to be played into the medium term financial plan. But what those precise numbers are, officers will obviously look at based on the data they've got available.
Any further questions or comments?
Almost summing up, so in respect of the observations that have been made, I think it's appropriate that elements of this report form part of the budget scrutiny process, but I also think, I believe we changed our terms and conditions of this committee, which allowed us to report to Cabinet from time to time on issues, and therefore, given we have effectively 2 years accounts here coming to a conclusion, albeit some errors outstanding, which we're fully aware of, that the Audit Committee should pass these recommendations to Cabinet and highlight them on the agenda would be my recommendation.
Mrs. Benny?
Yes, it was just a final thing. It was just going back to the 1920 accounts. Have we got a plan, a timeline for the resolution of that final outstanding issue in terms of the pension transaction? Dare I say?
So the pension transaction was the subject of a degree of legal debate and commentary by our KC and obviously Council's advice as well. The latest position that I'm aware of was that our KC provided us with advice which we've shared with the council, and that involved a supplementary discussion that the council needed to have with the actuaries, because the advice made certain assumptions around the actuarial valuations that have been given in respect to the pension transaction. So I believe the council are still exploring that issue with the actuaries.
Yeah, thank you. Just as a supplementary to that, so yes, we're working very closely on this one. The advice, as much as we can pass on, has been passed on to the actuary via Devon, who administer the fund. I'm hoping that we can all get together and reach a satisfactory conclusion sooner rather than later. We were hoping that maybe this side of Christmas, but time just drifts away, doesn't it? So we are working very closely on that one, and I'm working with our colleagues to resolve that one. It'd be nice to get that one out of the way before we get into the next financial year.
Thank you. Just summarising, Councillor Nari said, I would also like to endorse the recommendation that the minutes of this meeting and our recommendations is sent to Cabinet as well as part of the process. In conclusion, does anyone else have anything else to say or any questions to ask before we move on? In which case, unless members have anything to say to the contrary, we note the recommendations contained within this report from the external auditors, and we're grateful. Thanks, Mr. Dossett, for all your hard work. Thank you. Moving on, we take item number 6 of the agenda, which is the external audit, the audit plan 2020-2021. And I believe, Mr. Dossett, you're in the driving seat again.
Thank you, Chair. I'll pass over to Justin if she wants to make any additional comments. But essentially, this is an updated audit plan. It was presented originally back in 2021, but it was important for us to update the plan to reflect issues that have moved, to make sure that we got our value for money risk assessment correctly flagged up in the plan, so that the report is updated for members to note and obviously to ask any questions. Justine, is there anything you want to add to the what's in the plan?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Just to say that the audit planning for the 2021 audit is almost complete, and we're actually starting the field work for that audit on the 5th of December, so that's actually next Monday. So although we haven't been able to sign off the 1920 accounts, members can be assured that we are, setting up and executing the 2021 audit. And the aim is to carry out the 2021 audit and complete that by early spring or late spring. And then we've got the 21-22 audit later in the year. And we are hoping to catch up at some point. So at some point we'll have sort of 3 sets of accounts to sign off, probably in about a year to 18 months.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions and comments. No? I mean, I have a very small, concern more than anything else, looking at page 63. Could you tell me a little bit more about the interest swap problem and the recommendations to manage that risk, please?
So, in April 2020, the council engaged in a hedging option with I think Santander Bank, and because that was an unusual transaction in the sense that it's not an everyday local authority transaction, what we raised were some two issues really. One was around the governance process about approving such transactions, and that featured in the report that we published in July 2021, which looked at the governance arrangements around the pension transaction and that transaction, and the council has responded very positively to that and put a number of new processes in place to address those risks, a new sort of governance framework around all of that. The other issue is how that's accounted for in the 2021 accounts, and that's obviously be part subject of the audit that Justine just described in taking place. And essentially, there's some very complicated accounting for these sorts of hedging instruments and how they play forward, and that's something that we're still discussing with the council as to what category it fits into in terms of financial instruments, because essentially there's two options. There's the option of fair value through profit and loss, and then there's the option of through other comprehensive income. And the difference that makes is quite important potentially going forward, because if you have an investment that goes through fair value, profit and loss, that means that if the value of the investment goes up or down, that gain or that loss is plays through general fund. Now, at the moment, there's a statutory override that prevents that from happening, but that statutory override finishes at the 31st of March 2023, and SIPFA and DLUC are discussing as to whether or not that statutory override continues or if it's stopped. If it's stopped, it exposes authorities with such investments to that movement between the fair value movement. So you could make a profit in 1 year and then a loss in another year, which is not really what local authorities want to do with investments in terms of hitting general fund. But of course, if it's accounted for through other comprehensive income, that doesn't hit general fund. And so that's a sort of accounting debate that we're having with the council at the moment. And there are different views as to what the right answer is. It's quite a complicated issue. At the moment, it has no impact because the statutory overrides in place prevents any movement on the fair value assessment. But we'll have to wait. It will become a more pertinent, relevant issue if the statutory override ends on the 31st of March 2023. We have no way at the moment of knowing what's going to happen. Although I believe SIPFA have recommended bringing it to an end, but whether or not DLUC decide to do that, I'm not aware at the moment. So it's quite a complicated issue.
Thank you for the explanation. Councillor Finn.
Yeah, I'd just like to take up on page 64 about the risk identification. You clearly state within it, however, the council's minimum revenue provision calculation does not include the correct application for minimum revenue. On investment properties, the council has a large number of investment properties, and the borrowing attributed to these only has MRP charged against it. If there is a decrease in value, this is not in accordance with the CIP FA code and not considered to be prudent. Considering that, and obviously taking into consideration relevant facts with regard to property price slump, interest rate rises, etc., in your professional opinion, do we as a council need to consider a debt ceiling to make sure that we don't get ourselves in trouble on this point?
So there are arrangements in place which have been recently sort of clarified by DLUC in terms of prudential borrowing for local authorities, and clearly all authorities should to borrow within their means, so within the means to be able to pay back, and failure to do so was absolutely fundamental in what brought down the finances of both Croydon and Slough, and now doubtless Thurrock as well. And so it is really important the council does ensure that its debt is well managed. What I am pleased about is that the council has restructured debt in the last couple of years in a way that reduces risk. The council had previously quite a lot of short-term variable debt with other local authorities. I think there's now much better structure in terms of long-term PWLB debt On this particular point, when we look at the minimum revenue provision, what's happened over the years is a number of local authorities have minimised that figure to perhaps an unacceptably low level. One of the things we looked at in terms of what Plymouth have done is your overall level of minimum revenue provision was circa 2%, which actually from our point of view is not unreasonable and is reasonably prudent. This was a sort of compliance point with the sort of SIPFA code that we felt hadn't been met. So whilst we would recommend that the council would comply with this, stepping back and taking a bigger picture view, the minimum revenue provision is not unreasonable in totality, and the debt is not unmanageable in totality. So clearly I would urge caution about any further significant growth of debt, and certainly borrowing to purchase investment properties is something that is effectively now banned by DLUC. That having been said, the council's investment properties have proven to be quite good investments, and so these things are sometimes quite difficult to sort of judge in the round. But yeah, I mean, clearly this is a time with interest rates rising that we'd expect all local authorities to take a prudent approach to this.
Any further do you want a supplementary on that?
Yes, it's just to clarify that debt ceiling point of view. How far away do you think we are from that, or do we need to consider a strategic way of bringing in that ceiling to protect the finances of this council?
I'd probably ask for the Section 151 officer to offer a view on that.
No, there's a couple of things just to point out, isn't it? We work very closely with what I consider to be the best providers of advice on treasury management and investment strategies. So we were having not a board meeting this morning, but an official meeting where we went through all the different stats and so on. So just to give you some confidence, it's not officers sat in a dark room doing things on their own, and we do involve elected members to that as well. So that's that part. In terms of the ceiling and whether we're pushing it and whatever, all I can say is I'm very strongly of belief that we need to keep visiting and revisiting our capital investments and our capital programme. And if it's not no return on that investment, then we have to very carefully consider before we start taking borrowing out. Times move on, and I think we've heard that already this afternoon, haven't we? When interest rates were down, bubbling under 1%, maybe times were a bit easier. But now that they're already pushing sort of 4% and possibly going higher, we're going to be more prudent about those things. So just to give you comfort, I'm doing a weekly review at the moment of the capital programme to see what we can do. Asking ourselves questions, for instance, if you get a grant that comes in and it maybe covers 85% of the scheme, that used to be good news. I know spin it around the other way and say, well, where does the other 15% come from? So we're looking at it all the time. I'm confident that we're keeping it under control. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Northey. Any further questions or comments on this item of the agenda? Mrs. Benny.
Just one final one in terms of page 65 of the pack. I was just interested in terms of our role again around audit and governance committee members and around the characteristics of the methods and models used to make accounting estimates and things. And I just wondered, because we had a training session, didn't we, about 18 months ago, but we've got a change of faces, and I'm just wondering whether there might be an opportunity to have another training session so people are clear about roles and responsibilities, and also specifically to look at that and make sure actually proactively we're discharging our responsibilities as a group of committee members, and that'd be okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Benny. That's a very sensible suggestion. I mean, I'm a newcomer, as it were, so I would welcome a bit of training. Mr. Jager, any comments?
Oh, members laughing at me. I see no reason why we can't set that up, Chair.
Councillor Pem.
Can we also think about that in terms of both the member development strategy that's being worked out and also the development for members of scrutiny panels that we're looking at?
Any further questions or comments before we close this item? Unless members say to the contrary, we will note the external audit plan 2020-2021. Thank you for all those questions and comments. Move on to another weighty document, the internal audit half-year report, which is item number 7 on the agenda. There's 3 parts of this which members will need to consider this afternoon. We'll be reviewing the findings of the report, which goes without saying, but we'll also review and note the head of audit mid-year assurance opinion and review and approve the in-year changes to the audit plan. Now, I believe that Ms Davis is dealing with this. Brenda? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This report, it is a fairly comprehensive report, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. But what it aims to show members is the work that we've carried out across the authority in the various service areas since April 22. It shows you in the appendix at the back of the report, it shows you the reviews that are scheduled to be undertaken in quarters 3 and quarters 4. Including areas that have come out of the plan because perhaps the risk profile in the authority might have changed. We've worked with officers, it's no longer the best use of our resources, and there's other areas where I've labelled it as unplanned work, where our time and resources have been refocused. And also it's got the head of audit assurance opinion, which is on page 85 of your pack, and that is reasonable assurance. And that's our mid-year opinion. It's based on the work undertaken in the current year, but we also take into account our knowledge of work undertaken in previous years, and it's an ongoing, really rolling programme of review. And it is specifically around the internal control framework that is operating across council service areas. When we do our work, we look at various areas of control and corporate governance. So you will find in the appendix at the back of the report, we've done work around Plymouth Active Leisure, which has been brought back recently into the council. And we've looked at a very high level at the governance arrangements put in place to actually administer that company. We also look in much greater detail when we're doing work in some of the areas, particularly around the financial systems of payments, income, and we look very, very much about what the arrangements are, what the rules are, and then are the officers actually following those rules. And I think that's probably an important area to bring to members' attention, because at the moment things are working very, very well. But we do have some concerns, as I'm sure everybody does across the authority and up and down the country, because of the financial circumstances that local government, public sector are finding themselves in now. We have to make very, very sure that the back office, which I think Paul alluded to earlier in terms of the finance section, the importance of some of those back office functions are essential in ensuring that the checks and balances and the monitoring of everything is in place. And if that breaks down from the internal audit perspective, obviously that could we would form a different view on internal control. But at the moment, it's robust, it's really working well. Officers know what they're doing, they're committed to what they're doing. But it has to be said, and it's no surprise to anyone, they are under pressure. If I can take you to page 86, page 86 just gives you a flavour really of some of the diversity of the audit coverage. The first paragraphs, it talks about the work we do around cyber, because as everybody knows, cyber attacks are growing in frequency, they're becoming more sophisticated. Health authorities, local authorities, they've all been victims of cyber attacks. So again, we've done work on behalf of the council at Delt Services, our software provider, to look at the arrangements that they've put in place, and in particular a recent piece of work is around backup solutions, and they've got a new one in place, and we're very pleased. It does provide effective safeguards on data, and should the worst case scenario happens, we've got confidence that they would be able to the council wouldn't lose its data. So some really, really important things. And you hear so much about what's not working, but it's nice to hear what is working as well. Key financial systems, purchasing creditors, again, just what I've mentioned, it's really working well. Officers are focused and they're committed to the maintenance of sound controls. But again, we're highlighting the important that resource limitations are addressed to make sure those controls are maintained. Plymouth Active Leisure, I've touched on. Page 87, it just touches on fraud prevention and detection. We work very closely with my colleague sat beside me. Ken will provide you with his report later on in the year. We also, as a local authority, you're required to take part in the National Fraud Initiative, and we can provide assurance that all the data sets which we coordinate have been sent off to the Cabinet Office for that exercise. I'm not going to go through Appendix 1 because that details each and every piece of work we do. Where work has been completed, it provides you with the assurance opinion for those individual pieces of work. It shows you where work has been deferred, work that has come into the plan that wasn't included in the original plan. But I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed for that comprehensive report. Open floor, questions, comments, observations. Mrs. Benny.
It was just a quick question, thank you, it's just for clarification. So you've set out on page 85 the reasonable assurance, and then you look through the appendix. Is it based on just those that have been completed, or do you have, like, I know you said you also base it on historical stuff, but is it about the melee of different things at different stages upon which you base your judgment?
Yes, it is. But having said that, if the work that we undertook in year, we were coming up with a lot of amber or reds, whatever history, however good the authority had been historically, that would obviously detrimentally affect this opinion statement at any given point in time, which is why for members' knowledge and insight, we actually put the opinion statements against every piece of work we do in year, and we rate it red, amber and green so that you can see. And what you'll find is the majority of them are, in old terms, sort of good, or in some cases sort of very good. There are a minimal number of areas where there is limited assurance. And where there is, where we make recommendations, it's important to say that there are action plans to address those recommendations, and we track that those recommendations are actioned and report that to this committee.
Thank you. Vice Chair.
Hi Brenda, good afternoon. Obviously the audit programme's there to accomplish many things, one of which, as you alluded to, which is about sort of improving service and customer experience. And I note this year there are limited opportunities to do that, and we had a discussion last week about how further changes might take place to the customer experience on behalf of by the council. And I'm in in a position now where my casework's exponentially increased in response to customers ringing me and asking for help in the absence of the council being able to respond and help them. So this is a relatively new experience for me, which makes me wonder if something is going amiss in a particular area of the council, because they're not able to resolve their situations. So they're coming to us as councillors, and I'm sure I'm not alone. So is there any way that we can actually do an audit, dare I say, of the customer service experience or parts of that experience for council? Because you'll be aware yourself, if you do ring up the 668,000 number, you can literally wait for quite a considerable period of time. And certain elements of being able to communicate with the council are also being switched off, making it more of a challenge. So I wonder if we can't possibly think about, either in this year or next year's audit plan, the opportunity to look at the customer experience in more detail from an audit perspective, please.
Yeah, so in the current year, we've pretty much got our programme of work through to the end of the year, because this is the time of the year we do a lot of work around the key financial systems, which feeds into, that's important in providing assurance that the internal audit service is doing adequate coverage, obviously, because the key financial systems are what feeds the annual accounts. But yeah, certainly, obviously, I'm going into the process of having discussions about audit plans for next year. I'll be working quite closely with David as the Section 151 officer on that, so we can certainly take away your comments and have some discussions around it.
You're on that point, I mean, looking at page 98, there's already a survey report that's been published. Did that take into account what Councillor Lowry suggested about the helpline? Or is this something which would need to be specifically focused?
No, those surveys are where we go out to actual officers across the authority and say, we've done a piece of work for you. What do you think of that? Did it help you?
Thank you for the clarification. Councillor Penberthy.
Thank you. And this might be my ignorance sitting on this panel, so I've just checked back through a couple of previous sets of papers. I've sat on audit and governance panels before in higher and further education, where the panel actually got to see the report, not a summary of the report. I just wondered whether that was practice here, and whether the report, if it had an implication on an area being scrutinised, was also made available to scrutiny, because just a summary of a report isn't the same as the report itself. I just noticed that in some of the bits where it said it was complete, it said refer back to last month. I referred back to last month and there was some commentary, there wasn't the report itself. So I just wondered whether council officers get to see the internal audit report and members don't.
So when our reports are issued, our reports go, we don't issue them, we haven't traditionally issued them to members. That's not to say members can't see a report if it's of interest to them. But the reports are owned by, we do the work for the local authority, their reports are essentially owned by the local authority. And when we issue them, they go up to strategic director, so all the way through up the management chain, the reports go through.
Just in addition to that, unless there is a specific reason why they can't be published, they're all public reports and would be available to anyone who requested them. And whilst we find them incredibly valuable, the number and depth of them is such that it would be difficult for all of them to be published to appropriate scrutiny committees. But either cabinet members or scrutiny chairs would be briefed if there was a report relevant to their area of business, and
also, if there are any recommendations that cut across any of the work that they were doing, I think they're routinely reported. So they're not confidential, and there's no custom and practice for there being a reason why they're not published. It would be sensible for them to be requested and of interest, if you see what I mean, as opposed to be routinely published to scrutiny has been the sort of position thus far.
Yes, Councillor Pemberth.
Yeah, so if I was to look at one which falls under my remit as a scrutiny chair, which would be housing benefits, and this is in the September report, so sorry for those scrolling through, because I've just looked back to see, because it would be of interest to me. I don't routinely read audit and governance papers unless I'm going to be sitting in on a meeting, and you highlighted deterioration in the administration of benefit overpayment recovery. There's millions of pounds, I know, in the budget. It's a budget pressure. I was unaware of chair of the scrutiny panel that was there, so it wasn't added to the potential things for us to look at, because I'm not sure there is a mechanism for internal audit reports to make their way through. And I just wondered whether, in trying to tie things up in the same way we're trying to tie risk up, there needs to be some way of tying up internal audit reports so that executive members, shadow cabinet and lead spokespeople for other political groupings and scrutiny were aware of internal reports that were going through, so that they could also look at those as necessary.
Mr. Jago.
Thank you, Chair, through you. As you know, Councillor Pemberthy, we've started to do the same with risk. You're absolutely right, there's no mechanism in place at the moment. Given that we're moving now on to the action planning stage of the external scrutiny review, it would seem sensible that we include it as an action within that.
Thanks, I'm just trying to tie the dots up.
Mr. Northey.
Thank you, Councillor Pemberthy. As someone who receives all of these reports, be careful what you wish for, because you will be inundated. And I think what we try, what we try to do as officers is make sure that we see the recommendations and that we act upon them. And then I see your role is to make sure that we do put those recommendations and improvements in place. But I have absolutely no problem with sharing any of the reports, but just be careful, there are lots and lots of reports.
As I said, I sat on an audit governance committee before. I do know what that looks like. However, we get a policy briefing at scrutiny panels for any reports relevant to our area, of any area of national government activity, and it tends to be 2 sides of A4 long, with links to where we can find the detail if we want to then go and explore further. So I'm not necessarily saying everyone needs to see everything, but we need to know what's there so that we can look at it if necessary. I think it's just that bit of trying to make sure that we get full pictures, and that's especially around members, because while officers can be dealing with things, members have a legal responsibility. Yeah, for example, it's down to members to set a balanced budget. Officers can recommend and other people can do whatever they like, but it's down to members to do. So if members aren't seeing that information, if they're choosing not to read it, that's down to members.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments on this item? In which case, there's 3 points, as I say, to this. The committee hereby review and note the findings within the report. And we note the head of audit mid-year assurance opinion, which is very succinctly put, Brenda. Thank you very much indeed. And review and we approve in-year changes to the audit plan. Thank you. So moving on to item number 8 of the agenda, we have the risk management strategy. And I know Mr. Jago is raring to go on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members, the risk management strategy is in the supplement pack, pages 1 to 30. Many of you will recognise this. This is an annual review. This strategy has been in front of you several times. This year we've taken a slightly different approach to reviewing it, employing an external risk control manager through our existing contract with our insurer to review our process. Some of you have been interviewed as part of that process. Quite happy that the overall opinion that from the risk control manager is that our processes are generally working well, that risk awareness is embedded at a strategic level, but we have got some more work to do around the operational. So as a result of the review, probably less impact on the strategy itself, but more around some of the processes that support it. We're looking to implement a live interactive risk reporting tool that will help our risk champions in departments to manage that risk flow and make sure that our departmental management teams have a clear overview of risks facing the authority. We're also looking to reinvigorate our risk champions in departments. There has been some change to personnel over the last couple of months, so that's something we'll need to address, and including in that will be enterprise risk management training. In respect to the strategy itself, we've made a couple of changes, highlighting really the difference between our approach to risk tolerance and that of our risk appetite. We've also made some additions around how we address partnership risks that we might be exposed to, and we'll be we'll probably need to make further changes. We might need to come back again, Chair. As we improve our risk processes, there might be some changes to how we do some scoring, but we'll bring that forward when we need to. Other than that, I think that's all I'll need to cover at the moment. Happy to take any questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jago. I mean, I'm not sure any other members were interviewed by the risk control manager, but I certainly had an interview, and it was an interrogation. It wasn't an easy 5-minute cosy chat. It was, of course, done very, very gentlemanly, but certainly it was a thorough interview, and I welcome that approach. Is that a new innovation that the insurers appoint the risk control manager, or have we done it before?
We get a number of days available to us through our contract. We've, as far as I'm aware, not having been involved in risk until very recently at this authority, Chair, as far as I'm aware, they've not been utilised in the way we've utilised them this year. We expect to continue to be able to do so over the coming years. It's been a valuable tool to us. It's within our contract. It doesn't cost us any money, so we're going to take advantage of it.
Absolutely, it's an additional sort of element of risk management which should be welcomed.
Yeah.
Open now to questions and comments. Councillor Finn.
No, it's just a comment. I wish to note that it's nice to see that the partnership risk being taken into consideration and the implications to this council, Chair. I think that worked. Thank you.
Councillor Penberthy.
Just doing a closing loops thing again. Section 13 roles and responsibilities, I know at the request of Audit and Governance Committee, scrutiny panels now get sent the risk paperwork every meeting. Within roles and responsibilities, there's nothing there at all on scrutiny or how that loop is closed once we receive a report, because scrutiny panels report back to Cabinet and Council. So there's no way, if you send us something at the moment, for us to report back to you on anything, your responsibilities. I just wondered whether in the next iteration, if scrutiny panels are going to be sent risk reports, we're listed within roles and responsibilities, and the loop of how that is done is worked through. Sorry, Ross, you're trying to include scrutiny.
Yeah, being intimately involved in ensuring that risk goes to scrutiny, I can't believe that I've missed it off, to be honest. So what I will do is make sure that addition is made relatively soon, and I'll, if it's okay with the committee, I'll get that approved through you, Chair, and the Vice Chair.
Yes, well done, thanks.
You'll never ask me to sub again.
Are you available next week? Any further questions or comments on that item of the agenda? If not, we will move on to suggest that the committee note the risk and the opportunity management strategy for 2022-2024. With grateful thanks to Mr. Jago and his team on that. Moving on to item number 9 of the agenda is risk management, the monitoring report, to include scrutiny update on risk management, which may be found at pages 31 to 60 of the supplemental pack. Mr. Jago, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Chair. In this update, there's been 3 risks removed from the strategic register, mostly because they were broadly a duplication of some other risks that existed on the register anyway, so it felt sensible that they were removed. The reference to the departure from the EU single market has also been removed because we felt that was covered in a much wider economic risk taken into account, war in Ukraine, inflation rates and so on. So those ones have been removed. There is a new risk, which is an amber risk relating to the government bus recovery grant. So that's in appendix, I think it's number 19 rather than 15 in appendix A, table 2. Those are the main changes to the risk register. What we have done, Chair, as well is add some additional narrative into the mitigation around the financial risk, just identifying the proposals put before Cabinet in just this last Cabinet meeting in November, reference the in-year budget. And the report highlights the consideration of risk at scrutiny. Councillor Penberthy's here, so can talk to that if he wishes. But certainly risk is now probably informing I'm hoping you're going to agree, Councillor Penberthy, it is informing the scrutiny work programme probably more than it has done previously. I think on this next cycle of scrutiny meetings, there may well be recommendations that come back from scrutiny to audit or Cabinet, depending on the action required. I'll leave it there, Chair, because I think the reports speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jago. Questions or comments on that report, please? In which case, the committee note that report. Thank you for the findings, and we note the current position with regard to the strategic risk register, and thank you for diligently keeping the registers updated. Moving on to another lengthy financial document, item number 10 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Strategy, which may be found on pages 101 to 138 of your bundle. I believe Wendy is dealing with that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. This report sets out the Treasury Management Strategy for 23-24 and includes the annual investment strategy, the non-Treasury Management Investment Strategy and the minimum revenue provision statement. It is a statutory requirement for the Council to produce this document, and it has its first airing at this committee and leading its way through to the full Council budget setting process in February. So, taking you through, the lengthy report, I'll draw your attention initially to pages 108 and 109, which sets out our key statutory and performance framework we have for both borrowing and investments. I'll draw your attention to page 109, which picks out an item where it has the operational boundary, a ceiling on borrowing, which has been raised earlier in this meeting, which is sat at 1095 million for the 23-24. I should stress this is a ceiling. It's not a target that we're aiming for, but we are aware we've still got quite an ambitious capital programme with over 200 million in the capital programme forecast for 23-24. These areas are, let's say, reviewed regularly. We take advice from our advisors, Arling Close, and just to note that the actual borrowing limits we're showing there are actually lower than last year, which sort of reflects the change. It's not to say the direction still needs to be looking in a reducing area while interest rates are high,
and while the need to balance the 23-24 revenue budget is still there. Taking you across to just to flag the areas that you see in a sort of shaded boxes are the specific advice that we've had from Arling Close. Reporting has been quite timely. We've been able to use their reporting information that they produced at the beginning of November. Obviously, key things they've highlighted is the quite a fluctuation with the increased bank rate, which has gone from 0.75 at the start of the year to 3% in November. Obviously, the expectations that interest rates are still expected to increase as well, which is obviously a concern we've got with our borrowing arrangements. So what we aim to do is actually reduce the amount of borrowing wherever we possibly can, and use our own cash reserves and any grant monies we've received in advance. Taking it forward again, there's on page 117, sets out the capital programme, and it's particularly useful just to see the level of borrowing that we're showing in those areas. And this, as already alluded to, is an area that gets challenged. It almost feels like on a daily basis rather than a weekly basis, but they are continually being challenged. And that's done at a more strategic level, all the way down to finance accountants linking in directly with project officers, reviewing their spending programme, and if there's any opportunity for savings or reductions or reprofiling of spend into future years. I won't dwell on any of the tables unless anyone has anything specific they want to raise on. Then taking it to page 121, sets out our Treasury investment counterparty limits, which basically is where we've used guidance from Arling Close to specify where we hold any investment monies. A lot of monies are held with sort of long-term investments through pool funds, and our day-to-day cash balance monies are held in a money market fund to maximise the highest amount of interest we can secure. Just picking up the main assumptions we've built into the 2023-24 budget are investments giving an average rate of return of 2% and new long-term loans with an average rate of 4%. So this will be a key area that will be monitored as a sort of key indicator. Taking it then on to page 126, we talk about our non-treasury management investments, and this picks up areas where, in particular, draw your attention to the Property Regeneration Fund. And this is an area where at the moment it's being challenged through interest rates, that we're actually being restricted where we can invest and develop. But it's an area where we've, like I say, we've monitored the return that we've already incurred at capital expenditure on, and that I think is the main sort of key points. That area, should have written a page number down. We make reference to our annual minimum revenue provision, and where we apply the PWLB rate, annuity rate, and forecast the provision based on the life of the asset when it becomes operational. So this has been an area that we review and link in with our auditors with, and that's the main bit of that report.
Thank you, Ms Eldridge. That was a fantastic summary, and it is encouraging to note that the borrowing is down and you're taking what is laudable and intelligent approach with short-term loans and getting
Yes.
the best rate and renegotiating loans where necessary to get us the best possible deal. Open now for questions and comments. Hi, Mr Dossett. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Oh, Vice Chair.
I would just say that having been a part of the group that effectively works on this strategy for a number of years, and we've discussed it in detail this morning, I'm happy to sort of recommend to committee that this report is ready for us to move to the next stage. Yes.
Mrs Benning.
I've got a couple of questions, if I may. It's more for general understanding, and I would like to say, actually, I found it really helpful with the grey boxes and taking me step by step through it. So it was really helpful. It was just really page 119. It talks about proposed borrowing as affordable, and it's linked to the ratio. If I'm reading this rightly, when is that a ratio not affordable? Because I sort of read that, and it talks about ratio of financing cost to net revenue stream, and this measure, is it that one or is it the one above? And I just wanted to check and understand, actually, is it linked to the percentages? And if so, when does that what percentage equates to not affordable?
That's a good question. I might have to take part of that question away, but the affordability feeds into the actual budget setting of what we can afford to fund the interest on to service the borrowing. So that'll be
I didn't know if there was like a rule of thumb of, say, if it gets to 15%, then actually no way, and I wasn't sure whether there's that threshold.
The main control will be with what the revenue budget can support.
Right, okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. And then the other one I've got is on, I've used the wrong page numbers, I've used the bit on my pack and not, so, oh yes, so it was linked, so page 124, and it's about the portfolio average credit rating. So we've got an A, which looks good. AAA would be even, really fantastic. So given that that's an average credit rating, I wondered if there's any, averages are great, aren't they? But is there anything where we've got AAA on one end and D, E, F, G on another end? Have we got any major variation within that we ought to be aware of?
No, we stick within, like I say, to the A and the A category. I'm just trying to see if there's. Sorry,
No, it's all right.
With a lot with the investments, we're actually the situation we're actually in Plymouth is we do not lend to other local authorities, etc. So our risk around that actual rating is quite low anyway.
Fine. So there's nothing hidden within there which is a bigger risk than we could assume by seeing that. Brilliant. That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Picking up on Mrs Benny's first point, I mean, certainly in terms of affordability of borrowing, that would be covered by the certificate you've given that it's within the prudential indicators and incorporates authorised limits and, Any more questions or comments, please? Take comfort in the fact that Councillor Lowry's looked at this as well and endorses it.
I would just add that this is a really interesting, I think is a really interesting part of the council's work. I'm not sure everybody would agree with me, but there is an opportunity for members to attend our Treasury Management meetings where you get a greater insight into the development of this. And we've always had a system where there's been, dare I say, cross-party work and 2 members from each side. And the reason we do that is because it's a great opportunity for new people to understand the complexities of what Wendy's been through today, for instance, and it's in my view, once again, very interesting. So I would ask that if you want to go back to your respective groups, I'm sure David can work together and sure we've got that 2 members from each party back on that board, so we do get some wider understanding of the complexities. And I know Councillor Finn's perhaps very keen, he might wish to join us on this journey, because it's very good for members to understand this over the longer term, because it is a very strategic part of the work we do on the council. But it's always considered a bit of a Cinderella service because it's not quite as front-facing as many other things we do.
So to clarify, Councillor Larry, then any member is entitled to.
No, they're not.
No.
Sorry, it is down to the leader of the respective group to nominate individuals to sit on that. But I'm sure if, for instance, you wish to simply attend the meeting, I'm sure David would be more than happy for you to sit there and watch events go on. But principally, it's for the leader to appoint 2 individuals to that from both sides. So there's 4 members there, and we get to discuss this in detail as we did this morning at length. And I think it's very useful for more members to get involved and understand exactly what is going on here.
Thank you for that. Yes. Any further questions, comments? I think the simplest thing for us is to move that as approved. Are we all in favour? Councillor, yes, all in favour? Excellent. Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, to item number 11 on the agenda, which is the capital finance strategy, which may be found at pages 139 to 148. And I believe that's you again, Miss Eldridge. Thank you.
Okay, not quite as meaty a report this time, but again, it's another statutory report we're required to provide, and again, this is the first airing of the report before it follows through to full council decision. So the key sort of context of this is around setting out how the council manage its capital programme. It's the capital framework that governs it, the current criteria for governance, and where governance sits, and that's aligned to the council's financial regulations. And then it also, I think the more interesting pages for members will be looking at the table on page 141, which sets out the 5-year capital programme as at the end of October this year. This will be developed further and incorporated in the main budget setting report. There's a list of sort of key projects which are in the current capital programme, which will be of interest to members. Then over the page is quite a useful graph that explains how the funding of the 22-27 to 27 capital programme is made up, and a particular area is really just noting the increase with borrowing from previous years, where current borrowing funds 60% of the capital programme. And obviously this is, again, another area being monitored, particularly in light of the points raised by Mr Dossett about central government funding and grant funding being even more challenged in the current economic times. Then I think the key other point just to raise is around, again, the Property Regeneration Fund. But again, this is where the focus of that fund is to assist the redevelopment and economic development of the city, rather than any direct investment properties, which is obviously no longer an option to fund from the PWLB. So that's the report.
Thank you very much indeed. Questions, comments, observations? Councillor Larry?
I wonder, going forward, picking up on David's comments and your comments and the auditor's comments about grant funding. So normally, we build a road, 80% of the money comes from the government, the other 20% comes from us, and off we go. And often, the cost of building the road actually increases, and often the government says you're not having any more money anyway. So actually you get into a scenario where you could end up potentially funding 50% of the cost of the road, which has happened to us before. I'm just wondering if there's something we need to highlight as a committee in this report about picking up further grant funding from government, or even, dare I say, refusing grant government funding because we don't want the burden that potentially goes with it, or lobbying them to change their methodology around funding roads, as an example, because we literally cannot pick up that slack anymore because we don't, particularly given interest rate scenario. So I've gone around in a circle here, but I think you get my point. And my concern is how do we, I mean, that's our job, to, to express our concerns as an Audit and Governance Committee, that actually we need to be very prudent in taking on any further debt going forward. So I need someone to turn that into to something more reasonable than I've just burbled out. But there you go.
No, just to say thank you very much, Councillor Larry, in picking up on the points that we made. And we will try and put that into some kind of recommendation for you. Yeah. All I was going to say is these two reports that Wendy's just presented come as two separate reports, but I think as you hear them, you can see how they are linked together. Yeah. And more than happy to try and share the thoughts that go into it. We're very grateful that Councillor Larry sits on the team and has got many years of experience and can nudge me in the right direction. But you can see the complexities of the government saying you must stand on your own 2 feet, and some authorities, not Plymouth, going off and taking that literally and buying up whole industrial estates, and then the government saying that's not quite what we intended, and then changing the rules, and we all get caught in that. So that plays into both sides, doesn't it? Because it's part of our capital strategy, but it's also part of our treasury management strategy. So, and then the other point I was just going to very quickly make is picking up again on what Councillor Larry said. We do keep a very watchful eye on what it's costing us. And my example of sort of an 85% grant, which might have looked very appetising when we were paying 1% or less for borrowing, is not so now when we're at 4%. So as a sector, it's not just Plymouth, we are lobbying and saying something needs to give. But of course the autumn statement itself seemed to cut back on infrastructure projects nationally. So I don't think they're going to be surprised if we write back and say we have to defer or defray or whatever. So I just want to make those couple of points. Thank you.
I think Councillor Larry doesn't want to pay for the Forder Valley project any more than we used to.
I certainly don't. I certainly don't. Trust me.
Councillor Finn.
Yeah, Chair. Just to bring up what Councillor Lowley basically said, we know that, say, one capital project that's just gone through is overrun by absolute millions. And I think it may be a recommendation worth considering from this committee that in future the contracts are nailed down tighter. Cost overruns are added into the cost of the contract with regard to completion dates, etc. And from a strategic point of view, the directors pay due notice of that. Can I mention in public about the crematorium, for example? Yes. Yeah. Say the crematorium, obviously the projected build cost was about, 13, 14 million and ended up at 29 million. Well, that's obviously going to have a huge implication with regard to the borrowing that we and the financial position that we as an authority put ourselves in. So I think especially with regard to large contracts like that, there has to be greater oversight, lock-ins, regard to timescales, projected costs, and somebody to actually keep an eye on it, because it's horrendous how that just ran away within a period of a couple of years. So it's just an observation based on what Councillor Lowe said, that if we seem to be doing our best and something does happen, and and we can keep an eye on it, basically.
Councillor Pemberton.
I was just going to sort of come in on that, really. I think there's a difference between accepting a government grant for a costed road programme, for example, where we've actually done the work and said this is what it's going to cost, and then post-contract bills come in and things go up, than us saying we're going to explore doing something, and then when we try and deliver what's right for Plymouth through our own decision making, as well as other factors, things can change. Now, if we were going to say that, actually the Life Centre and the box are both examples of where the projects grew in scope. And the new crematorium facility is another one of those where actually, once you started exploring it, the scope changed, and then how we secured additional funding changed, and all sorts of things. So I think we have to be careful. There's a difference between us applying for funding and things changing than us saying, actually, what's the right thing for Plymouth? And as that develops, the programme changing due to our results. Now, I think, we did the scrutiny on the crematorium, and there was an issue of the delay in letting contracts, and we raised that and made recommendations. But there was, by the time that had come in, actually most of the extra cost had been come in because of the development of an ambition. The same happened in the box, and the same happened in the Life Centre. And I'm sure if we were to look back, most of those major city-funded infrastructure projects, as opposed to grant-funded or grant-driven ones, are like that. And I think we just have to be careful that as a city, we don't say, oh, we've only got £10 million for this project. No matter what the city needs, we will only spend £10 million on it, because otherwise you limit the ambition at the start of things that should be flagships for the city. And whether we like it or not, the crematorium isn't a once in a generation, it's a once in a century. And we have to think about what money do we need to spend now that will still be working in 100 years' time. And the box is another one of those that is, the last one of the box was an Edwardian building. Efford and Western Mill are both late Victorian, early Edwardian buildings. Those are the sorts of types. I think we have to be a bit different than that, than widening Woolwell to the George, where we're seeking external funding and then saying, well, this is how much it's going to cost. And somehow the nuancing between that, I think we have to get right, because I don't think that otherwise, we put in process that hinders the city rather than puts in process that enables the city to be what the city wants to be. And how we do that. So I'm not saying no, but I think those are very different scenarios that we need to be careful about.
Valid point. Thank you for that. Any other? In which case, may I suggest that we move to approve this particular item? All in favour? That's carried. Thank you very much indeed. Now, away from finance, we take item number 12 on the agenda. Pray, Mr. Johnson, tell us how many of those surprise little darlings have you caught?
Thank you, Chair. So before you is the half-yearly report for counter fraud work for local government or Plymouth City Council that we've undertaken so far in the current financial year. It's not an overcomplicated report. The executive summary more or less sums up what we've achieved this year so far. What I would say is we're probably expecting similar, if not more, savings in the second half of the year, basically because of the way that we undertake the investigations and the way that they're coming through the system. I think as usual, the commitment to the counter fraud side of work from Plymouth City Council is to be commended. What I would say is we did undertake a sort of deep dive, if you like, and I'm not going to say it was a full audit, but it was a good sort of health check of what the council does have in place and what we need to work on. And I think that's sort of the important thing I'd like to draw people's attention to. It's on Appendix 1, it's from page 159 onwards. And I promise I didn't read the Grant Thornton report that said we should comply with the SIPFA regs, but it just happens to be coincidental. And you might be pleased to know that it's not an accident that Plymouth is quite compliant with that. I was somewhat involved in the formation of those best practice regs with SIPFA and SIFAS. There are areas of work, and I think it's funny that all this, Councillor Penberthy noted earlier, all these things are sort of tying together and the dots are coming together, and it's that risk assessment, which is the only really place that we really need to drill down and get a bit of granular detail into to support the ongoing work and where we want to focus going forward. Obviously, with financial pressures as they are, we probably need to focus a bit more on where the 151 and everyone else sees the risks and where we can be best sort of placed to make savings. So it was absolutely, I say it was going through it. Yes, I knew Plymouth would be compliant in a lot of areas, but it was pleasing to sort of go through it and see that it was all in place. And there were some things that we still need to work on, but we knew that, and I'll be looking forward to working with the risk area going forward to get some granular detail in. As we know, it's not getting any easier. Financial pressures are increasing. When that happens, the more financial pressure there is, and I think I've talked to committee probably endlessly about this sort of thing, the more pressure you get, the more people will make decisions they wouldn't normally make, and they will go and potentially look to defraud not just the council but other government agencies. So the public purse is under attack, but we're doing all we can, and as I say, it's refreshing to see that Plymouth is still supporting and still committing to that. As I say, it's not an overcomplicated report. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to field that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I mean, certainly impressive. Paragraph 1.2, savings of £520,000, £994. Commendable. Questions? Councillor Penberth.
Thanks. In paragraph 6.1, you talk about us receiving 277 referrals in 6 months.
Yeah.
How does that refer across our family group? So are we doing, have you got any comparators? Because if everyone else is only receiving 1 or receiving 10,000, then, it's a bit difficult to know where we are.
It's a weird scenario, and it's not an unusual question because every local authority treats this slightly differently. 277, I would say, is a good standard. When I look at other local authorities up and down the country who actually have any fraud resilience left, and that's not very many, those that have more and more referrals are actually doing a better job than those who have none. And if I was to say to you locally, if you looked around at our neighbours, or your neighbours, and looked at how many referrals are actually received and credited as fraud referrals, you'll be lucky to find one. So I think you're doing very well, but I would say that. But compared to other local authorities, when I look at, I talk to local authority fraud leads up and down the country. There's a similar sort of setup in York with Verital. They're a bit like Devon Audit Partnership. Yeah, it's absolutely comparable. This is the sort of level that you should be looking for referrals. And at half year, that's pretty good.
Councillor Finn.
I need to just clarify something first. As a member of Devon Audit Partnership, are we allowed to discuss the Devon Audit Partnership relationship with the council?
I would imagine it's all parcel of the.
It should be all right.
It's linked information.
Council committee,
yes.
isn't it? It's a committee of the
Can't
council.
see any issues with that.
There isn't any issue.
No.
Go ahead then, Councillor Finn.
Oh, that's all right. I didn't want to shoot myself in the foot before I'd ask the question. That's all right. I thought it's always best to check first. Basically, it's just a general question. How are things going with the Devon Audit Partnership, and are they providing added value to the council in your audit work? That's all. Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you. Are you referring to Plymouth City Council or?
Plymouth City Council, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just how's the relationship? Is it working?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's. I mean, I hate to say it, but you're probably in a better position than most with counter fraud work, because the team that still does all the investigation work, and Plymouth supplies the bulk of that, used to be the corporate fraud team within Plymouth. So those relationships are already very good. You've got a new 151. We've known each other quite a long time. That sort of relationship is already there. So yeah, we get along very well with Plymouth, and I'm sure they get along very well with us, to be honest. So, and adding the value, you can see that it speaks for itself. So,
Mrs. Benning.
Thank you. It's a question probably for officers, dare I ask. So we've generated savings of about 520,000. I'm just interested to understand whether that's is that a happy bonus for us in terms of the financial planning, or do you build in assumptions around fraud prevention in your financial planning? Because I'm just interested, because that's like, oh, great, if we get the full year effect of that, then we get £1 million in the bag. But actually, is it already built in or not?
Very good question, Mrs. Penny. Oh, Mr. Johnson.
I'll have a stab at it. The fact of the matter is figures for counter fraud, call it fraud and error if you like. We have to call it fraud and error because obviously those who don't get convicted of fraud have not committed fraud. So it's an error. We know what that is, but that's the way we deal with it. These figures are Cabinet Office figures per case or related to direct savings on council tax or something along those lines, or if there's a direct billable service that we can claim back. If it was a straight case of these figures were going straight back into the 151's budget, then I'm sure that there would be even more investment than there is currently. It's not that easy. Some of this is cost avoidance going forward. So for argument's sake, when we get a social housing property back from someone who's illegally sublet that, the council's not going to see an immediate influx into its bank account, but what it's not going to do is pay for another person to be emergency accommodated in emergency accommodation. So, and the finances beyond that are quite significant. So we have to sort of put a figure on it, but I'm afraid David doesn't see an awful lot of it.
So it's the complexity, the knock-on effects, and the additional costs hidden away, which is the benefit.
Yeah, what I would say is if you don't go looking for fraud and you don't actually deal with any fraud, you'll never know the extent of what you're dealing with, and that's the scary thing going forward is, for those of you a bit more informed about the fraud side of things, there's been papers from the House of Commons, House of Lords. They've recently set up the Public Sector Fraud Authority. So it's all starting to swing round because we're all running out of money. So it's a case of where can we plug the gaps and try and save some money rather than keep on spending. So.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for that report. Thank you for the great work you're doing. I know you did have mentioned in your report before about the iceberg scenario that most of the fraud is below the surface. So congratulations and thank you for that. Unless members have anything to say to the contrary, the committee recommend to note the half-year report. Thank you. Moving on to item number 13 of the agenda, we now will have a look at the tracking resolutions, which you'll find pages 169 to 172. I notice quite a few of the areas have been shaded in and are complete. So going through, is there any points you wish to sort of identify, any problems or issues?
Chair, I think it's just appropriate to pass on our thanks as a committee because all too often we have, dare I say, been critical in the past about actions outstanding. I've noted of the past 6 months there's been a considerable improvement and members are being sent regular updates as to the request for more information or resolution of items outstanding. So I'd just like to pass on our collective thanks, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to endorse that. And looking at the amount of grey shaded areas saying complete, it's certainly a step in the right direction. Mr. Norrie?
Oh, sorry, just through you, Chair. I just noticed that the first one outstanding from July 22 about COVID grants. I think, well, I do know that I've spoken to Brenda on that one, and the report has come through. And if you haven't seen it, we'll make sure you do, so that we can grey that one out. So just to give assurance, that report was undertaken.
Thank you. Any other comments or observations on this item? We'll therefore move on to item number 14, which is the work programme. A similar sort of thing. Let's have a look at what is on the matrix. And for members, that's 173 to 178 of your bundle.
maybe would just add to either maybe the 20th of March meeting an opportunity for us to discuss the issue raised by Miss Benny around training and understanding of roles and responsibilities.
That's an excellent idea, yes. And also on the works programme, we still have the DBS issue, which we're going to bring up the next meeting as well, which that's going to be, I believe, will be January.
16th of January.
16th of January.
It's on the agenda, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments on the works programme? I therefore suggest that the committee note the work programme to date. Grateful thanks to all involved. We therefore come to the end of our part 1. We have an item of exempt business, which is item 15 on the agenda. So I'm obliged to read the following passage to you. To consider passing a resolution under section 100A, subparagraph 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, to exclude the press and public from the meeting for the following items of business, on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 1, 2 and 7 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act, as amended by the Freedom of Information Act 2000. All in favour of this resolution? Therefore, I will close part 1